Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We're thrilled to present this panel entitled Beyond Redlining, Black Lives Matter and Community Development, sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is part 4 of a series of rapid response webinars on this topic. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs, including the section's other programs in celebration of Black History Month. Today's program explores historical patterns of racism in the context of redlining by exploring the intersections of the Black Lives Matter movement and community development. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function, please. If you do not see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, we're thrilled to bring you today's program entitled Beyond Redlining, Black Lives Matter and Community Development, Part 4. For a bit of background, redlining is a process by which banks and other institutions refuse to offer mortgages or offer worse rates to customers in certain neighborhoods based on racial and ethnic composition. Redlining is one of the clearest examples of institutionalized racism in American history. Although the practice was banned in 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, it continues in various forms to this day. Today, our panelists are Victoria Beattie, Barrett Holmes Pitner, and Etienne Toussaint. My name is Kiana Courtney, and I am a staff attorney at ELPC, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and I am joined by Nikiba Brown, an associate manager of business affairs at Havas. We are vice chairs of the Environmental Justice Committee of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. I'm going to turn it over to Nikiba. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Kiana. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited about this programming and part 4 of this series. So our first speaker is Professor Victoria Beattie, and she is an assistant law professor at Barrett University School of Law. She served as a litigation associate at nationwide law firms for 13 years until shifting her career to education in 2014. So since her transition, she has served as the Vice President of Operations for Miami Youth Garden Incorporated, which is a garden-based youth enrichment summer program where she wrote and taught a Black identity development course for middle and high school students. Currently, Professor Victoria is also a DEI consultant for a private independent school in Miami, Florida, where she also serves as co-chair of their anti-racism task force. She received her bachelor's in economics from Spelman College, earned her JD at Howard University School of Law, Hustle, and she received a master's in education at the University of Miami with a specialty in student life and development. She's currently completing a doctorate in educational leadership from DePaul University's College of Education, and her research interests center on Black student achievement and identity development in Black children. Thank you so much for being here with us, Victoria.
Thank you so much. I just first want to say good afternoon to everyone. I am so happy to be here and so elated to share with you some of my research. I'm a lawyer, but fundamentally my purpose in life is to educate. And I use law as a mechanism to understand how history has impacted the Black experience in education, and also how laws could help make equitable what is an otherwise inequitable system. So I pray that you bear with me as I kind of account through this historical foundation of what I term as the undercapitalization of Black education. And what I mean by that is how white supremacy essentially has been preserved through the curbing and underfunding and under-resourcing of the education of Black children, and particularly how that's been used through land use. from the first time, right, we arrived on these southern shores, we were denied a full education. It was forbidden for slaves to read, punishable by death in most southern states. When the slaves were freed in 1865, slave codes turned into Black codes, which continued to curb and prohibit the education of free Blacks. The post-Civil War Reconstruction era from 1865 to 1877 was a period of unprecedented growth in Black citizenship and Black education. Black men from the Freedmen's Bureau formed the first formal public education system in the Southern states for the education of Black people. They erected common schools throughout the South that were financed by the local Black community and benevolent Northern organizations. But Reconstruction ended. It ended in 1877 and was quickly replaced with Jim Crow. And Jim Crow lasted until 1954, the year of Brown v. Board of Education. And Jim Crow was codified essentially into law in 1876 with the passage of Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine. Unlike the Black codes, unlike the slave codes that merely curtailed access and frankly gave whites a little bit of leeway in whether or not they chose to interact with Blacks, Jim Crow for the first time mandated racial segregation, particularly in schools. With Jim Crow, we see this proliferation of the first Black-only schools and white-only schools. It was also during this era that we see the refusal of white people to fund Black education, whether that was through their opening of private schools in the suburbs or those who stayed in the cities reallocating school district funds to white-only schools. This practice, this abuse, this continuous under-resourcing was protected essentially because there was an absolute reliance on local property taxes for the funding of schools. Essentially, the idea is that for over a century, you've got Black property owners being the sole responsible party for the education of Black schools, but Black folk were effectively excluded from the housing market because of policies like redlining that impacted every single aspect of the mortgage industry and illegal zoning laws. And so the result, yet again, as we progress through this history, is the undercapitalization and under-resourcing of Black education. In 1899, Cumming v. Richmond County, Black residents of Richmond County, Georgia, sued the county tax collector for violating the 14th Amendment when they closed the only Black public high school in the county, claiming it was, quote, underfunded, while diverting those tax dollars to two white-only schools in the district. The county contended and the US Supreme Court agreed that while all citizens had an absolute right to share in the benefits of taxation without discrimination, the education of children was absolutely a matter for the states and could not be abridged absent clear and unmistakable disregard for human rights, right? And so you have this case Cumming v. Richmond County, which ushers in this mass closure of Black high schools because now it's determined that Black education only need go to elementary school. So here we are again with the undercapitalization and underfunding of Black education. And so you have the decision in Brown, right, in 1954 that essentially forced states to evolve how they were going to preserve white supremacy through education, right? So now with the termination of de facto segregation, school funding and the racial impact of school funding becomes masked. And it becomes masked behind this concept of equal opportunity, equal educational opportunity. You know, Chief Justice Warren wrote in the Brown opinion that education is the very foundation of a good citizenship. And he continued to say, in these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity where the state has undertaken to provide it is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. So in interpreting Brown decades later, right, interpreting Brown 1, interpreting Brown 2, courts decided that the way they were going to ensure that schools desegregated was to identify a certain number of factors. And these factors were outlined in cases like Green v. County School Board of New Kent County, these factors that courts were going to use and were using up into the 70s to determine whether or not a school district was in fact providing equal educational opportunities. And so these courts looked at this myriad of factors: the racial composition of the school district student body, the racial composition of the faculty, the racial composition of the staff, transportation, extracurricular activities and facilities. All of these, if you notice, focus on the school, right? They don't focus on the child, right? They essentially associate equality in education with the quality of the school. And those two things don't, if you have a good quality where the resources are like the white school, then you're equal, right? Without ever identifying the individual needs of these students, right? So fast forward to 1966, 12 years after Brown. President Johnson has just passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he has commissioned the Coleman Report. And the Coleman Report is designed to be first of its kind, where they're going to go out and do the first nationwide accounting of all the students in the nation, their welfare, their levels of achievement, and everything from that. And honestly, what President Johnson wanted was the proof that the Southern states weren't desegregating, right? But Coleman found more than that. Coleman also found not only that the Southern states were not desegregating, but that there existed an achievement gap, that an inherent achievement gap that existed between Black and white students. And he was the first to identify this concept of a nationwide racial achievement gap. He identified in the Coleman Report in 1965 that 87% of white 12th graders placed ahead of the average Black 12th grader, right? So let's compare that to today. Today, 2022, 75% of white students have placed ahead of the average Black student in both math and reading, right? So you're only talking about a narrowing of a couple, 10 to 12 points over a period of what is over 50 years, right? Researchers claim that although the gap is in fact narrowing, if improvements literally continue at the same rate, it will be 2.5 centuries until racial achievement gaps are closed in math and 1.5 centuries before they're closed in reading. My research is focused on identifying why this achievement gap persists, despite desegregation, despite equal funding, right? Why it persists, and what we as the dreamers, what me as a dreamer of the Black race can do about it. So now, according to federal law, school receives money from the district for every child in accordance to their level of poverty, right? Presumably, the poorer the child or the poorer the number of children within the school, technically, the more funding the school is supposed to receive from the local, the state, and the federal governments, right? So, for example, Miami-Dade to this day boasts that that their students in poverty receive more per student expenditure and more per student revenue than their students that are not in poverty, right? This fundamental premise that poorer students are getting more money in this contemporary age of education. This premise has been used by politicians, it's been used by researchers to justify why we should no longer invest in education, why the exponential expenditures in education are getting out of control, and we're not seeing the benefit of increasing our spending, because again the racial gap is not improving. So I believe, though, that in my research and what I started at DePaul was to kind of explore, and as the saying goes, to follow the money, right? To explore exactly where this money is being spent, right? Because if it is so exponential, then what is actually happening to it? According to the National Center for Statistics, in the 2018-19 school year, public schools spent on average $13,187 per pupil. And I'm saying that as an average. Florida spends on average $9,000, okay? Of that monies, salaries and benefits for staff made up approximately 80% of current expenditure costs, followed by purchase services like food, transportation, and janitorial services, which was then followed by the purchasing of supplies like books and pencils, okay? So and nowhere in the priorities of the expenditure of each student's allocated revenue is there resources for the student itself, for the student himself, right? Even the bulk of Title I funds, schools have reported that they use this additional $300 to $500 per student, particularly if that student is in poverty. They spend that additional 3 to 5 students on teachers and on professional development for teachers, right? So you've got these poverty-based funds, right, that are designed to equalize education under this theory of equal opportunity, right? So we're going to give all poor people the same amount of money, and this money is designed, right, to improve the academics experience of these children. But the reality is that the children are not having any market difference in their experience because they themselves are not receiving the bulk of these funds and the benefit really of these funds. And so for me, my research is the idea of there's got to be another way, right? And perhaps, you know, we were born for such a time as this, is to rethink how we fund students, to rethink how we structure per pupil expenditures, right? And in the effort to mimic what truly was the intention of Chief Justice Warren, which was equality, right? The fact is, Black children need more. Right? They need more attention in school. They need more tutors. They need more summer school. They need greater access to VPK and quality daycare. They need more SAT prep, more writing and reading. They need more studying and life skill courses, more individual learning plans. And they need it not because they're incapable, but they need it to make up for the disparity that has existed since 1865 in what was poured into the starting points of these children, right? And what I mean by starting points, I'm talking about what was poured into the child before he brushed the narrow airways of the classroom. Before he got to the classroom, how much money were you investing in this child? How much money were you investing in the reading materials before he entered into the schooling education system? So so my premise is that until we equalize these starting points, right? Until we ensure that pre-K, all students enter pre-K with basic skills, equal access to reading materials and personal tutors over summer break. Until this is fixed, Black education will remain undercapitalized and frankly, in derogation of Brown v. Board, right? So equal opportunity for me, fundamentally, is the equitable distribution of resources. And equitable distribution means you must take into account the individual need and allocate resources accordingly. We can no longer hold on to the watered down holding of Brown v. Board to ensure that Black children are fully educated. We have to reconstruct, we have to relitigate, we have to re-legislate new notions of an individual's right to education, right? I personally believe, and what I've spent my time doing is the answer is the private funding to me of public education. And so what I'm currently doing is working with some fellow Black educators in securing for a Black boarding school, securing funding for a Black boarding school. And the idea is that the school will sit on land owned and developed by that school, and that land will be developed into residential homes and commercial businesses. And the idea is to create this circular use of resources where the rental and the selling of the revenue of that land provides for the school, and the school is able to provide food, employment, and education for the community. So like I said, it's just rethinking funding and rethinking source allocation. And I believe these two components honestly are the mechanisms by which we can close the racial achievement gap and perhaps create a new business model by which we can honestly for the first time in the nation's history, fully fund and fully educate our students, our Black students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Beatty. Our next speaker is Professor Etienne Toussaint, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. He teaches contracts, business associations, secure transactions, and other courses related to business law, political economy, and critical theory. Professor Toussaint is a critical legal history scholar of political economy, political theory, and intellectual history. With a focus on urban communities in the United States, his scholarship explores a diverse array of issues from economic and environmental justice to community economic development, affordable housing, and food justice. His article, Black Urban Ecologies and Structural Examination, which is the basis of his talk today, was published in the Harvard Environmental Law Review. Professor Toussaint is a graduate of MIT, where he earned a BS in mechanical engineering. He earned his JD at Harvard Law School. Professor Toussaint.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to join this talk. Similar to Professor Beatty, I am a lawyer. However, as noted, I got my background in engineering. And so I tend to think about issues by starting with a structural analysis, a systemic analysis. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, to explore how redlining and the effects of redlining continue to reverberate beyond the housing context. I'm going to just talk about two things today. First, a theory that I call structural extermination, to try to explain how the impacts of redlining continue to impact communities today, and a little bit about the history of urban farming legislation in Washington, D.C. So first, I'll just provide two definitions to help you get a sense of where I'm coming from. The first is this concept called Black urban ecologies. Environmental degradation in Black urban communities, I argue, is linked to three things: anti-Black racism, white supremacist culture, and the word culture is very important here to think about, and it will connect to our following speaker, Barrett, Holmes, Pitner, and third, capitalist exploitation. The second concept is called racial capitalism, and it argues that the development, organization, and expansion of capitalism in society has pursued racial directions, which helps to explain why we see racism continue to permeate in the social structures that emerge from capitalism. So what is this theory of structural extermination? It has three dimensions. The first is exploitation, which I argue stems from this enamorment with this idea of American exceptionalism, the notion that there is hope in a meritocracy that defines America, notwithstanding the exploitation that we see taking place in our labor market. The second is the concept of expropriation, which relates to the privatization of public goods in urban development and the weakening of the public welfare role of the government that enables private stakeholders to expropriate property that generally should be held in common by the community. And lastly, this concept of erasure, and more specifically cultural erasure, which connects to what I think Barrett will talk about, but it clarifies how the delegation of public accountability from the government to private stakeholders erases the history of state-sanctioned discrimination from collective memory and often furthers gentrification, or as I call it, structural extermination of certain people from communities of interest. How does this relate to urban farming in Washington, D.C.? Well, let me give you some details about Washington, D.C. Because of redlining, in particular, Washington, D.C. remains very segregated. Washington, D.C. is divided into a number of wards, and approximately 11% of D.C.'s total area is defined as a food desert, which means it lacks access to healthy and nutrient-rich food. 51% of those food deserts are located in Ward 7 and Ward 8, east of the Anacostia River. If you ever visit Washington, D.C. and take a walk around, you'll notice that a lot of the individuals living in those wards have darker skin than those living in other wards like Georgetown that have also higher valued properties. So there's a racial segregation that manifests also in the segregation with access to healthy food. Those poor neighborhoods, which are predominantly Black and filled with other minorities, have high poverty rates, limited transportation, limited full-service supermarkets. Ward 3, to provide a counterpoint, majority white, higher income, and has no food desert. Ward 2, where we find Georgetown and George Washington, and the White House, also doesn't contain, it does contain a food desert, but it's only 0.13 square miles. Here's another graphic that just gives you a sense of the relationship between the location of food deserts, which you see in pink on the left, and the location of poor neighborhoods, which you see on the right in the red. There is an immediate overlap there. What does this mean for the population in DC? Well, most of the individuals living in those food deserts, those low-income communities who are Black or Hispanic, they tend to have underlying health conditions such as asthma, diabetes, obesity, and the like. This directly connects to what we saw happen during COVID. Those populations suffered much, much higher rates of death across the District of Columbia. So what you have, I think, underlying this is a tale of two cities. You have parts of the city that are flourishing, that are beautiful, and other parts of the city that are in decay. And we saw at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, 81% of the people dying in Washington, D.C. from COVID-19 were Black, directly connected to this circumstance of food insecurity and the underlying health conditions that it animates. What does this have to do with urban farming? Urban farming has an interesting history. We started talking about urban farming in the 80s in Washington, D.C. as a way to address food insecurity that was becoming prevalent during that time. Because of redlining, because of segregation, you had certain communities in DC, even in the 80s, we could observe that simply did not have access to healthy food. And the thought was, let us create some gardens, let's create some urban farms to get fresh food into the hands of low-income Black folks. As you can see here, over the years, there have been attempts to modify and improve upon this act, even up to most recently 2019. And the fundamental question that I'll leave you with is, does Washington, D.C.'s urban farming legislation and this historical narrative demonstrate a model of structural extermination? First, exploitation. And I'll just point out a couple aspects of the various legislative amendments over the years. The final amended version of the program is structured as an open market competition for individual and private use of land for a period of 5 years, and to be granted to applicants with experience in agricultural production. It does not include preferences for marginalized residents, does not regulate where and to whom the farming produce is sold, does not identify a plan for urban education around agriculture, although some recent conversations have started to talk about these shortcomings. Expropriation, well, it offers an opportunity for those who use the land to get tax exemptions, essentially suggesting an effort to privatize the delivery of fresh and nutrient-rich produce. But this does weaken the government's role as an advocate and protector for the public interest of those food insecure neighborhoods, because there's no telling where that food is going to go. In fact, it's likely that a lot of it may go to downtown DC, to high-end restaurants who are looking for that fresh produce. And it also transforms the social and economic justice of those poor communities into a private cost-benefit analysis. Is it more economically beneficial to sell that produce to a restaurant or to low-income folks who live next to these urban farms? This approach, coupled with America's history of racism in capitalist markets, targets and exploits the perceived rent gaps in poor Black communities, the fact that the land value is low, and expropriates that public land for the benefit of private entrepreneurs who have the capital to get started and the expertise to exploit that resource. Finally, erasure. The legislation waives soil testing requirements, which is outrageous in a sense, for urban farmers that use agricultural technologies that do not require the usage of contaminated site soil. What this means is if you have areas of low-income Black communities where toxic waste was dumped or the soil is contaminated for other reasons that we know, there's a long history of environmental injustice that manifests in contaminated land in poor Black communities, you need the capital to utilize the latest technologies, and then you can bypass sort of those soil testing requirements that can be quite costly. there's a question about why the local government doesn't want to pay for that. But also, during Jim Crow, this era of United States racial apartheid, low income and minority residents in DC actually relied upon cooperative economics and a local food industry to obtain healthy food, to work together, because their public health was neglected by the government. And that cultural history is largely erased in this legislation and replaced with a sort of private marketplace, a competitive marketplace, an individualistic marketplace where everyone fends for themselves. So we lose a sense of this culture that Black folks have been using to sort of work together to mitigate some of the forces of the market that inhibit their public health. And if we go back in history in DC, we even see local cooperative grocery stores where the Black community sort of came together to make sure that everyone was getting access to healthy food. Unfortunately, these cooperatives, the district grocery store cooperative, eventually kind of fell apart. And the reasons are complex, but as we know, these sort of local efforts to feed people who were being neglected by the government was eventually replaced by supermarkets, and those supermarkets are just not meeting the need. So I'll stop there and pass it off to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Etienne. That was really good. Thank you so much also, Victoria. I'm so excited to delve into the questions that we're getting in the Q&A. Our gentle reminder to everyone that we will be accepting questions, not in the chat, but in the Q&A box on the lower, I'm not sure what corner it is. I think that is my right. It is. I went to law school, not math school. Our next speaker is going to actually be Barrett Holmes Pitner. Barrett is the founder and philosopher-in-chief of the Sustainable Culture Lab, and he's a contributing writer for the Daily Beast and the BBC, and a lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. His book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, released in October 2021, was named by NPR as one of its top books of the year. Congratulations on that, Barrett. He has a master's degree in journalism from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University and a bachelor's degree in political science from Furman University. Thank you so much for joining us, and I am so excited to hear your presentation today. Barrett, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Nice seeing you again, Nakiba. So yeah, as you heard from my bio, I am not a lawyer. I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this conversation because we have slightly different professions, but they enhance each other. So my book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, I take a philosophical approach to talking about systemic division and inequality in the United States. And the method that I take focuses significantly on language, and specifically the absence of language. And so, to kind of transport people back to how I came to this concept, when I was a writer, or when I started writing at the Daily Beast and I was writing about race and culture, I noticed that the complex cultural nuances I was trying to articulate in my pieces weren't resonating as strongly as I hoped they would. And it wasn't that people didn't appreciate what I was writing. It was just that these points weren't coming across to my readers based on the comments and stuff that I would get from them. And so it hit me that there might not be a word to talk about the cultural root of our systemic problems. Like we talk about like racial inequality and all these economic issues and, stuff pertaining to capitalism and this, that, and the other, but we don't really have a language to talk about the culture that precedes the creation of these exploitative structures. And I felt that's what we really needed to get to the root of the problem. And so the word ethnocide is the word that I came up with, sort of also brought it back because I put the word together myself. It means the destruction of culture while keeping the people. But fortunately for me, a lawyer named Raphael Lemkin had already invented the word in 1944. Lemkin was a Jewish refugee from Europe, and he came to the United States to escape the Holocaust and the Nazis. And when he came to the US, he was trying to tell influential American politicians and military leaders of what was happening to the Jewish people. And they didn't believe what he was saying. And it hit him at that point that maybe he needed to create a word to describe the atrocity that was happening to his people so that people could understand what was happening. And at that point, he created the word genocide. And so genocide is this word that we think's been around for ages, but it was actually only created in 1944. And geno speaks to a people, inside is murder, killing. But since Jewish people were a people with a distinct culture or an ethnos, he also created the word ethnocide, and he imagined that those words would be interwoven, interchangeable. But as we know, ethnocide's kind of been forgotten, and genocide's the word that we talk about to talk about these mass atrocities. So luckily for me, a lawyer had already done the work and come up with this concept of ethnocide, and there's a basic legal framework for incorporating facets of ethnocide via genocide into international and domestic law. But what I do in my book, which speaks specifically to the American situation, is I use the word ethnocide to describe the transatlantic slave trade and the cultural foundations of the United States, because the goal of the transatlantic slave trade wasn't a genocide. There wasn't a goal to create a society in the absence of African people, where you either erase them or forcefully remove them from their land and live in a place absent of them. Slave trade was, we're trying to make, colonizers were trying to make a society that depended on African people being a part of it. But for them to be a part of it, you had to systemically destroy their culture in every facet possible. So that meant, colonizers were not preventing Africans from speaking their language, not allowing them practice their religion, not letting them wear the clothes or their traditional hairstyles, breaking up families and communities. Anything that was the culture of African people, there was a systemic, intentional agenda of erasing that from millions of people, and then having these people whose culture had been systematically and intentionally erased be a foundational component of American society. And that component of American society was predicated on sustained division. America created a language, a discourse, where if one drop of African blood, touched a white person, that person was no longer white in perpetuity. You couldn't be partially white. You were either purely white, and if you had a drop of something else, you weren't. And so this cultural foundation based off of ethnocide and sustaining the oppressive, exploitative foundations of ethnocide is also the foundation of what we consider America's racial divisions to be, because you had to keep these divisions so that the people who were tasked with exploiting and destroying the culture of the other didn't get confused with the people they intended to destroy. And you can see how this cultural fabric influences American society to this very day in facets that it's hard to fully comprehend because it's everywhere. And one of the key things that I talk about in my book is that America never cared to develop the language to describe the horrors it has inflicted on other people. So ethnocide is not a common language in the American discourse, because clearly the people who created a society based on destroying the culture of African people while forcibly bringing African people to America and then giving them, to bring them here to be exploited and oppressed in perpetuity, they didn't feel there was a need to create a word to precisely describe that atrocity. And so we live in a society where the atrocity that we see, that we know happened for hundreds of years and has shaped so much of the American economy, the cultural fabric, where cities are even located in America. All of it's based on an atrocity that America's never cared to name. And if you can't name the problem, it becomes much harder to actually attempt to solve it. And so my work pertaining to what I do at the Sustainable Culture Lab in my book works to name this initial problem. And once you do that, then you can start incorporating this language into the many problems that we see nowadays that we try, to articulate via racial distinctions. But we notice that these racial distinctions, these racial classifications kind of come up short in describing the problem, because we're not talking about the culture that preceded the racial classification, the culture that made the racial classification. So for example, like we know that white is not a place on the map. You know, like if someone is German or French or Swedish, we know that that's a place on the map. Those people have a culture that's from that place. You know, even if we're going to be like really vague and say Africa, we know that's not a country, that's a massive continent, but that's a place on a map where their culture comes from. Their way of life comes from that place. White is not a place, and Black also is not a place. So what they did in the Americas is they created these cultures that are based on sustained division within this place. And we have this conversation as if these races or these cultures are the same as if you lived in China and that's your culture, or Iran, Persia, things like that, when they're completely different. And due to this kind of corrupted language, it makes it harder to come up with adequate solutions. And so to kind of go, I'm a DC resident. Etienne used to be a DC resident. And to look at his map, if you look at the division of Washington, DC, we know that there's food deserts. We know that there's redlining. We know all of these racial divisions in Washington, DC. We can easily talk about that by using the language of ethnocide, and it makes it so that there's a much more can do like connective tissue to everything that's happening. So I really appreciate Etienne consistently kicking to how my work and his work connect, and it shows how the benefit of lawyers and philosophers, how we can get a lot of good work done. But for example, just a brief history of Washington, DC, it was supposed to be a square, and we know it's not a square because the Virginia part isn't there. America and our cultural commitment to erasing this atrocity that is ethnocide from our discourse, we never like to talk about why Virginia isn't part of DC anymore. It just isn't. But the fact is that when it was part of DC at the beginning, that part of DC refused to give up slavery. And so America, the nation's capital, didn't want to have a part of the capital that was pro-slavery. And the southern part didn't want to have a part that didn't have slavery. And so for about 50 years, the Virginia part and the former Maryland part just fought over whether they would keep slavery or not. And eventually, Virginia said, we're never giving it up. And DC said, fine, you can just become part of Virginia again. And so DC is literally only a fraction of what it was supposed to be, because a section of DC refused to give up the ethnocidal practice of chattel slavery. And now if you look at how DC is structured to this very day, you can see that the Black parts of the city still, even though they don't believe in slavery, have a dynamic that is based on sustained exploitation and a justification of that exploitation because it's economically advantageous for white people in DC to get more services than other people because they'll pay more money for the goods. We articulated via economics with a complete absence of a cultural awareness. And so that's why you'll have food deserts. That's why the area that I live in used to be a redlined area back in the 1950s. And now it's, once the one Black family moved into that white area, all the white people left, and now it's a very Black community. And during the 1990s, this was an area that didn't have much resources or anything like that. And you weren't supposed to even come here during the daytime. It's not because the Black people in here were bad per se. It's because America's ethnocidal society had come up with an economic argument to deprive Black people of services because it was economically beneficial for white people to have these services. That's what America says. And we've said that from the beginning. The transatlantic slave trade shows that. This was an economic argument that they made to kidnap African people, strip them of their culture systematically, and then build an economic structure based on constantly depriving Black people of culture as a form of perpetual exploitation and exploitation. That's just what America's done. It's not good in any way. And so what we deal with today is we have the myriad of derivatives and ramifications of this foundational cultural practice that still rears its face in everything that we do. And so just to keep on talking about the neighborhood that I live in DC, it's now an area that's becoming quite gentrified. And the thing that's really fascinating about this gentrification is that this is Washington, DC. Most people that move to DC only move here because they want to make the world a better place. No, a lot of people aren't moving here because they're like, I want to become a banker and make $1 billion. Like, you go to New York if you want to do that. That's not why people move to DC. So the people that are gentrifying the neighborhoods that used to be Black in DC, they're actually like really great people, but they come from a community, a culture that doesn't articulate the benefit of culture. So they come in, a Black family will move out. They don't have any understanding of the effort, the culture, the community that was built in this area for Black people to survive in this area without any government resources or support, while being, condemned and demonized for decades. They don't get the effort that went in to sustain this community without any resources. They're just really happy that they feel they're coming in and their wealth is better. And then the thing that's fascinating is there's not a cultural understanding that you need to become part of the community that existed before. People will come in here, they'll buy a house, and they'll just stay in that house. And they won't know their neighbors. They won't do any of the cultural community enriching things that helped the community survive and thrive for decades that most Black people kind of instinctually know that you're supposed to do, because we have to survive by creating culture, because we're not going to get the resources because our society has articulated a benefit in depriving us of those services because it's economically beneficial for us to not have services. It's pretty dystopian. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of well-meaning people coming in and they engage in ethnocide, not because they're trying to be, negative. It's just because that's the cultural fabric of how they've been taught how to live. And you have to be able to have these type of cultural conversations so you can make cultural change, which then can have an impact on the racial divisions of our society. And so, my work focuses on ethnocide, and that's about it. And I'm wrapping it up, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Barrett. And thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us all. We're going to turn now to the Q&A. But first, I have a question for you all that should kind of gets at the intersection of this. So we talked about the undercapitalization of Black and Brown students to secure white supremacy, urban farming legislation as a method of structural extermination, and ethnocide of essentially our culture. So can you talk about the intersection of these issues and what legal or other tools exist to get at how these inequities perpetuate redlining and the exploitation of Black people?
Was that to me specifically, or to all of us?
All of the panelists. And as the panelists are answering those questions, everyone please put your other questions in the Q&A.
Well, I can just go real quick. Essentially, like what the other panelists are talking about are the components of creating culture that you need to survive. You can't have a community of people without education. That's just not a thing that you can do. And so it's not a coincidence that America created a society that intentionally made it impossible or very, very hard to educate Black people, and consistently has created, burdens and arguments to articulate why it's beneficial for Black people to have education, people to have culture. The clearly food, affordable housing, the things he's talking about, that you'll make it hard for them to think survive. Just does that. Did I freeze?
A little bit, but you came back.
Yeah. Let me jump in real quick. So if I understand your question correctly, it was sort of what are the intersections of these various topics, and how can students and advocates today sort of think about reform? It's such a great question. It's a complicated one, but I think that, to me, culture is a unifying thread if we take seriously the intersection between culture and law. And it's not something that we think about often, the way we typically learn law and think about law is actually based on this historic notion of law as natural, as a law as existing outside of society, and then imposing its rule of order upon society. But for law students that are interested, there's a really fascinating sort of law and cultural movement that occurred in the late 20th century that sort of grabbed a lot of concepts from the cultural studies movement. So they latched onto thinkers like Pierre Bourdieu from France. And they basically argued that law and culture have a symbiotic relationship, which means that, in fact, in many ways, culture constitutes law. It is culture that defines the categorizations and legal concepts that shape how we experience the world, right? It is law that puts a definition around race, sex, gender, and then that sort of manifests in how we think about our relationship with one another. And so I think when it comes to reform, part of the task is really dissecting the way culture has shaped our analytical frame, has shaped the way we think about law and law reform. And I think it connects back also to some of the things that Professor Beattie was talking about with respect to education. I mean, culture has shaped how we think about what it means to be education, how we think about the right to an education. I mean, if it wasn't for Black folks, there wouldn't be public education in this country to begin with. It would just be the elite sort of going off to private boarding schools. So we really need to get a strong sense of that history. And then I think challenge some of the legal norms that are in fact cultural norms and that do not reflect the multicultural views of our society.
So I wanted to jump in, and I'm going to handle the first of our Q&A. But before, I just wanted to make a very brief comment. So Kendall Manson made a really good comment in the comment section. She said she doesn't understand how it's 2022 and Black communities are still being stonewalled. And when I read it, I thought of course, what Victoria had to say and how we're being stonewalled. And I never thought of it from the educational perspective in that way. And of course, so many of us have lived in DC. So you went to Hustle, I went to Howard. You guys are both, current or recent DC residents. So we can actually speak very poignantly on the gentrification and how fast it is happening in DC. And of course, this is like an ABA panel. So 50% of our attendees right now are DC residents and work in some federal capacity or other. And so I just thought it was so perfect for Barrett to now come and actually conceptualize it and give us an actual word. And also thank you for talking about the conception of the word genocide, because what you said, Etienne, just now was so true. It's a cultural shift that becomes law, because we have a genocide convention in the international law, and it's strictly enforced. And I think in the same way, Etienne and Barrett and I have sat on this impetus committee where we're trying to incorporate international law into local law. It's absolutely a possibility, and that's why we have our section of the ABA, the civil rights section, where we can turn a concept like ethnocide into something that is actually legally addressed, addressed through policy, addressed through legislation. And I think that is where, especially because two of you guys you guys are all professors, I kind of want to lean into a question where I turn the table on you and I ask you to actually critique the laws that are or are not doing any kind of good job of eradicating this systemic discrimination and stonewalling, as Kendall so greatly put it in the comments. So each of you guys, if you want to just, quickly run down on what you brushed on and how the law is actually supporting white supremacy.
I think, there's this phrase that, the school system is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And so is the justice system, right? They were designed for the preservation of caste. If you look at Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and this was all fundamentally built on the economics and the transacting upon Black bodies, right? And what it was going to take to keep this race in a certain space, right? When Blacks were freed, there was the concept of the Negro Problem, right? And W.B. Du Bois dealt with that significantly, and the issue of the color line and how prevalent that was about to become in this 20th and 21st century. And I fundamentally believe that that as written, it is designed to preserve white supremacy. So there is actually now if we are looking to do something about it, you do have to look at the restructuring of the very system itself. There is no, we have this, they go inside and work from within, but truly, and I can say this as a DEI consultant, what's happening within is what's supposed to be happening within. I deal daily with Black kids that are being expelled and suspended and inordinately punished, harshly dealt with lack of remorse and lack of empathy. And all of that is justified by the rules. All of that, they can point to any rule to justify why this Black boy and this Black girl is being treated the way they are. And so to me, there is no concept of working within. It has to be restructured. We have to relitigate the issue of equality. We have to talk about this again and revisit this since Brown, and then force the dialogue. And so to me, I think it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and the only way to change that is to truly change the system.
I'll make a brief point. So I don't know if we could really answer the question of causality. I don't even think some political leaders want the system to fail or impoverish their Black people in the way that it does. But I think to Professor Beattie and Barrett's point, I think sometimes it fails us and we can't avoid it because we hold on to these cultural ideas. And the one that I think that we continue to hold on to is this notion of what it means, is this notion of value. How do we place a value on a community? And then how does that value translate in the marketplace? We typically frame that value in terms of capital. We define it as capital and whether it raises demand, and we look at supply, it's traditional sort of economics, but we do not tend to place a value on things like social capital, on cultural capital, and we tend to devalue Black spaces, right? But sort of that old cultural conception of what is valuable in an economic market, we certainly don't value labor inside the home. So God forbid you stay home and take care of your kids, good luck. It doesn't matter if your children are gonna, in the future, benefit the economic marketplace as workers. For the time being, just good luck. And God forbid a pandemic happens. Then, if you die, at least you're essential. But I think it's important for us to question some of these fundamental norms that govern how our system works. If you look at DC, and I think Barrett pointed this out, the notion of historic preservation, what communities deserve to be preserved, the communities that are deemed to be valuable, and the communities that were Black were not valuable. So those were not historic preservation communities until white folks got in. And then, of course, you got to preserve those brownstones because, now the property values have gone up because the Black folks have gone out. So I think there's just some underlying norms that govern how we value space and place that we really need to push back on.
So let me just go real quick. I know we're running out of time, but to carry on with what the other panelists are saying is my work is you have to have a language to describe the root problem. I think, frankly, we spend a lot of time talking about like the branches that are problematic that come from like a rotten tree. And we have this notion that like the tree itself isn't rotten. So the idea that like, how is this still happening in 2022? That question implies that we expect that things just to naturally get better because the roots are good. That these negative things are some weird deviation. But if you know that the roots are bad, then the reason that it's still like this in 2022 is because it's supposed to be that way. And you have to have that different conversation. And, all of us alive right now, like we didn't make the system in the 1600s, 1700s when these people made it. So it's not like we're wholly responsible for what happened back then. What we have the responsibility for is having profound thoughts, having like engaging conversations so that we can make our society better. And you have to do that whether your society is good or bad, foundationally or not. Like that's the task. And so, there's a lot of foundational problems in our society. And if we have conversations where we imagine that it's just like a rotten branch, this place or that place, we're never going to get to the root of the problem. If you don't get to the root of the problem, you can't solve it. And I think the root is an ethnocidal foundation that's based on destroying people's culture, people believing that you can live via destroying other people's culture, and articulating that it's economically beneficial for that to happen. And if you look at it that way, you can see how many of the arguments for why Black homes and Black land doesn't have the value that it's supposed to is rooted in this problem. And if we have the language to describe it, it's much easier to have the language for the solutions.
Well, thank you all for your response to that. I see that we have actually run out of time, but I think it's important to note that we spent some time talking about DC, and I also lived in DC for a little bit too, but we see these issues across the country too. It's not unique to DC that this system is functioning exactly how it is supposed to, which is to the detriment of Black people. And so I'm going to actually pass it over to Naikiba to close us out. And thank you all again for your questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And sorry that we didn't get to all of them.
Absolutely. Just would like to reiterate, we are so apologetic, and I'm so actually heartbroken that this is ending. I wish it was 2 hours because I think we're just scraping the iceberg here. But in that spirit, thank you so much for joining us for this free webinar. We'd like to also express gratitude to our esteemed group of panelists. You guys are doing amazing work, and we're really grateful for the time you were able to take out of your schedule today and to share your knowledge and your research and experiences and the phrase that you are coining and you are perpetuating and you are getting into our vocabulary and culture and eventually our policy and laws, ethnocide. Thank you so much for that, Barrett. The section of civil rights and social justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. So we hope that this helps in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. You may do so at ambar.org/CRSJ, and you can find information on other free programs that we host on our webpage. So best of luck in your work and stay safe.